in the frontal lobes that we haven't talked about at all yet. But in fact, this is the area of the brain that most distinguishes the human brain from the brains of any other species. The prefrontal cortex. What does it do? The first hints about what this part of the brain might do comes from another very famous case study in psychology, the curious case of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railway worker. There was an explosion and a long, sharply pointed metal bar actually went up under, right up here, and it came totally out, shot up completely out the top of his head. And it obviously did a fair amount of damage, particularly to, as you can see, the frontal parts of his frontal lobes. Now, one point to make about that is it's not a easily described function. This isn't just language or visual recognition. It's something more complex than that we usually talk about, as I did in the video, in terms of what is called executive functioning. What's involved in executive functioning that humans are able to do much, much better than any other species because we have such better developed frontal parts of the frontal lobes. One part of this is the setting of goals. But now we're talking long-term goals rather than immediate goals. And long-term really covers anything from just a couple of minutes from now up through the remainder of your life. So goals that go beyond exactly what you're trying to do exactly at this moment. Reflecting on the future, setting relatively long-term goals, organizing complex sequences of behavior also depends upon the frontal parts of the frontal lobes. So even if you're working on a task in the immediate present, and the goal is just, to build something or to get from one place to another, it's not that far in the future that the goal is located. If this requires some complex organization of behaviors in a sequence, it's going to depend upon the frontal parts of the frontal lobes. So planning, organizing, reflecting on the future, and inhibiting inappropriate behaviors, especially behaviors that may get called forth by features of the immediate environment or your immediate desires. So stopping yourself from being too impulsive and impetuous depends upon the actions of the frontal parts of the frontal lobes. And this was one of the problems that Gage had. He tended to do in the moment whatever he felt like doing. So he would go to work, but sometimes he'd just walk off the job. And he actually eventually, he only lived 12 years after the injury. During that time, one of the main ways he made money, he held a number of jobs, but he kept getting fired because he wasn't reliable. Even with basic jobs, he wasn't reliable. And he certainly couldn't do a job that required telling other people what to do, engaging in complex problem solving, complex decision making. But he'd go into his job and he'd get hungry and he'd leave. He wasn't able to inhibit those immediate needs and desires very well. And that inhibition also occurs heavily in the frontal parts of the frontal lobes. So in fact, I was mentioning, one of the things this was a very famous case even at the time, this guy's had this huge hole spike go through his head, people were amazed. So he was part of a sideshow. He traveled around, and people paid money just to see him and talk with him. And that's how we made enough money to survive. Any questions on our discussion of the different parts of the brain that we've talked about so far? Let's take a 5-minute break. Come back around 12:05.